Hello, I'm Brian Lucareli, Director of our Private Client Services Group and co-chair of our Family Offices team at Foley and Lardner. And today I have with me John Litchfield, a partner and member of our Labor and Employment Practice Group. Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Good. And today we're going to discuss domestic workers in the family office environment. But John, before we get started, would you mind just sharing a little bit of your professional background with our audience, and then we'll jump right into it?
Yeah, sure. Very happy to. I'm a partner in our firm's labor and employment practice group. I sit in Chicago, Illinois. So my background is very Illinois centric, but try to take a broader view to things. I've been with Foley since I was a summer associate, so I won't tell you how long it's been, but it's the better
That's
part
good.
of, yeah, the better part of a decade and a half. So you can do the math. Yeah, and my practice is largely counseling clients on day-to-day labor and employment issues that come up. I've got a healthy book of employment litigation on my desk at any given time. And I also work with our clients on mergers and acquisitions and, kicking the tires on any companies that our clients are looking at to see how their labor operations are.
Well, that's great. So very timely. So why don't we get started? And let's start out with a little basics things. So who would be considered a domestic worker?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it seems to be sort of coming into a bit more focus in recent years. Some states are focusing in on ensuring that domestic workers are properly compensated and well treated. But essentially, a domestic worker is any worker that provides service or labor within a private home. It includes anything from babysitters to cooks to waiters, maids, butlers, housekeepers, gardeners, home health aides, family chauffeurs, and the like. And it's really essentially anybody who's employed in or about private home can be considered a domestic worker under both federal and some state laws as well. The Department of Labor, the U.S. Department of Labor, defines sort of what a private home is in the regulations. It's essentially a place of abode or temporary dwelling, is what the Department of Labor says a private home is. But it can also extend to a vacation home or a hotel. So if a family goes on a extended vacation and they bring domestic workers with them, that vacation home or hotel or other location can also be considered a private home. But generally, in the employment world, when we're thinking about a private home, it's something that's owned and occupied by a family. The legal definition in some cases can expand beyond that to include nursing home facilities, residential treatment facilities, and some other places of residence. But generally, it's considered a private home occupied by a family. But if you ever want some sort of more definition around what a private home is and what a domestic worker is, the Department of Labor has some really helpful fact sheets on their website they're essentially frequently asked questions that can help you sort of narrow down the definition. And the reason the definition matters is because there's some body of law around what a domestic worker is and how families or employers of those domestic workers are to treat them.
So pretty broad category
Yeah.
with a lot of opportunities. So with that in mind, what laws apply that I should consider before employing someone in a domestic worker position?
Sure. So it sort of depends on your physical location, and the number of domestic workers that a family might employ, right? So most federal statutes, and I'll talk about some exceptions in a minute, but most federal statutes have a minimum threshold of the number of employees that an employer has to employ in order for it to be covered. So if you have 15 or more employees who serve as domestic workers, there'd be a fairly sizable domestic worker staff for most households. Then basically most federal laws would apply. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and that would cover, anti-discrimination laws for sex, race, uh, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera. That's sort of the main employment law that most folks think about when they're talking about employment. But even for employers who have fewer than 15 employees, domestic workers, there are certain federal laws that will apply That includes the Fair Labor Standards Act, which governs how wages and hours are to be paid. The Immigration Control and Reform Act of 1983 will govern, and some other federal laws. But really, the question I think that a lot of employers of domestic workers will want to ask themselves is, where do I employ my domestic workers? Because there are state and local laws that may apply.
Okay.
So I sit in Illinois, as I mentioned earlier. In 2017, Illinois was sort of an early adopter of the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. And the Illinois Department of Labor has since then promulgated some regulations that govern how families are to pay their domestic workers. So, for example, um, what the law says in this context is that all time worked has to be compensated at least minimum wage.
Okay.
And employees who work more than 40 hours in a work week, who are domestic workers, have to be paid overtime, which is in Illinois, it's time and a half.
Okay.
That means that any time that a domestic worker has some sort of downtime, so let's say they're a live-in domestic worker, they actually reside at the family's residence and provide services. If they have time off, so breaks during the day or an extended period of time where they're not working, if they're interrupted at all during that downtime, that time has to be considered as compensable time. There's actually also a provision in this rule that I think is really interesting, is that domestic workers who are live-ins have to be provided at least 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep per day. And if that 5 hours is interrupted even for 2 minutes to answer a phone call or respond to an email or take care of some task the family needs assistance with, even if it's 15 minutes, that whole 5 hour period has to be compensated, and it counts towards time worked for overtime purposes. So there's just a lot of regulations in some states like Illinois that I think family offices are going to want to pay attention to make sure that folks are being properly compensated.
Well, that is complex and far more than I thought. So, hearing what you just said, can I pay domestic workers a salary? It would seem to me to be much easier to do so than to track hours and pay them hourly.
Yep, certainly would seem easier. But the answer is generally it depends. Your favorite lawyer answer.
Right.
And I would say that a vast majority of domestic workers are not going to be eligible for salary pay. That's largely because they won't fit within what the Department of Labor and the Fair Labor Standards Act considered, salary exempt positions. Salary exempt positions are anything from, sort of senior level management to people who oversee and direct and control two or more employees. That's considered an executive type employee. Uh, so there may be sort of senior staff who would fit within sort of those salary exemptions that you can pay a salary. But most of the folks who are providing labor and basic services are going to have to be paid on an hourly basis.
Okay.
Whether or not they're eligible for overtime will depend on several factors. Number one is whether or not there's a state law that requires overtime pay. So, for example, as I said a second ago, Illinois requires overtime pay for any time worked over 40 hours for any domestic worker who's not otherwise exempt, as I said, under the federal statutes. Um, so that's just a blanket rule in Illinois. Federal law, however, so if you have employees, if you have domestic workers in a state that doesn't have that type of regulation, then federal law will apply.
Okay.
Federal law says that live-in domestic workers, so the people who are physically, residing within a family home, but also providing labor services, if they're live-in domestic workers, you still have to pay them on an hourly basis, and they have to track their time, and you have to keep track of the hours worked. You've got some paperwork requirements, but they're not eligible for overtime. So you have to pay them at least minimum wage, which is at the federal level right now, $7.25 an hour. And you have to pay them for all time worked, but if they work more than 40 hours and they're a live-in, as defined by the Department of Labor, then you don't have to pay them time and a half.
Okay. So I know you mentioned this, you mentioned immigration earlier, but let's wrap up with that. And what about immigration?
Yeah.
Let's just say my domestic workforce is largely comprised of immigrant labor. What do I need to do to ensure, or the family office, to ensure that they're properly employing them?
Yeah, and this is a big thing, I think, in the domestic worker space. There are some industries that just it naturally have a high volume of non-citizens and immigrant labor. And I think domestic workers are one area where that's just a fact. So in general, every employer has an obligation to verify before somebody starts working for them an employee's identity and their ability to work, their eligibility to work in the United States. That's governed by, I mentioned it earlier, the Immigration Control and Reform Act of 1983. And essentially what you need to do as an employer, and this applies to domestic workers as well, or to family offices as well, is you have to have an employee complete a Form I-9 and then present documentation to the employer that proves both their identity and their eligibility to work in the United States. Now,
Right.
the Form I-9 is pretty self-explanatory, although it could probably use some clarity if you asked my opinion. But what it does is it spells out the documentation that any employer can look at legally to verify the identity and the work authorization of any particular employee. All of that has to be done within 3 days of employing a new employee. So in this case, what that means is that if you hire somebody as a domestic worker to come work for the family, within 3 days of their first day of employment, you have to have them fill out an I-9 and they have to present you with that documentation I just talked about. And then
Yep.
somebody in the family office is going to have to verify that documentation, meaning physically look at the documents that are provided. And they can't be copies. They have to actually be the actual documents themselves. Inspect them to make sure that they look authentic. You don't have to do a forensic analysis. They're not, the DHS doesn't require you to have some sort of special degree in inspecting documentation. You don't have to be the FBI agent. But you do have to look and just make sure it doesn't facially look like it's been altered or has any type of errors in it. You have to make sure it's not expired, and that it qualifies as one of the documents that would prove either identity and/or work eligibility. So that's sort of the first layer of things to consider. The second is whether or not you're employing folks who have some sort of temporary work permit or visa. And oftentimes, I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details about visas because there's multiple different types. But oftentimes, employers can help sponsor an employee to obtain a certain visa. That happens quite a bit in the domestic worker space. The only thing I would say is that if you've got employees who are on work visas, you should track the expiration dates of those visas. Make sure you understand what is required to renew visas when a renewal date comes up, so that you're sort of planning well in advance, and that if the domestic worker has to provide you updated documentation, you can request it with sufficient notice, because if their visa expires and they're no longer eligible to work, you'll have to terminate their employment.
Well, John, I want to thank you for your professional insights today in what is a far more complex area than I ever thought. And I want to thank all of you for watching our presentation today. For more information, please visit us at foley.com under Family Offices. Thank you.